external enablement. So external enablement is an entrepreneurial innovation approach to looking at how changes in the external environment via certain mechanisms trigger and shape and generate outcomes for organizations and their innovation/entrepreneurial activities. So the intellectual property comes from Professor Davidsson, also here luckily just back from Europe. And so we build on that, applying it in a different context, different technologies, and so on. So Dr. Janine Lay, she started 1st of September 2021. I checked it. So 10 months now, working with me, Per, and Martin, who's now in Europe. So yeah, via Greg Hearn and Glenda Caldwell, we started working with the Arm Hub. So that's another partner of ours. And yeah, we got introduced to this interesting context of manufacturing and robotics. So Janine actually has 2 PhDs. So this would be Germany, she would be Doctor. So she started some time ago with a PhD in physical chemistry, worked in mining, and through that came more and more engaged into research and the business side of things. And so then she decided to do her second PhD in open innovation. And she's also been working beforehand with some other colleagues at QUT like Anna and Rui. So yes, I think she's well established now in the QUT research community. And so yeah, I hand over to Janine for the presentation.
Thanks, Owen. Tell me if you can't hear me at the back there, because my voice sometimes gives out. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. To start with, whereabouts?
You need a sticker, we need an X.
Yeah, we had
All right.
one, but we pulled it off.
I'll move my cheat sheets.
Yeah, that's okay, perfect.
Okay, so to start with, I'd like to show you, because I haven't got a lot of pictures in here, and robotics is so photogenic, just show you a really cool robot to start with. And I can use this.
Yeah, yeah. Should be.
There we go. And can I just press play?
Yeah.
So this is one of the robots that
It's not playing.
What?
Okay.
Yeah, that steel producers use, and it's an industrial robot, so it's not something that you get near to. It's all caged and safety barriers. So let's have a look. It's an ad by the manufacturer, so it's just to give you an idea of the size, what it's working with, the movement of the arms, multi-dimensions. Some of our interviewees were steel fabricators, so they had this robot. And they costed a lot of money. But we just transformed how they work with the steel. These manufacturers have integrated each step. There are multiple robots that's all integrated. That's it. Really big one. There we go. So they're available now if you need one. And then I can click to the next one. Oops.
I think you're in YouTube now.
How do I do that?
Shift F5.
Beautiful. Thank you, Anissa. So what I'd like to do today, and hopefully not take too much time, is give you a flavour of our research to show you that, at least I think it's really interesting, and to show you the potential that it has for insight into how external enablers which I'll talk a little bit about, has that potential for innovation and creating new business activity. And so it's the first one, it's about enriching and enabling the external enabler framework that Per and colleagues developed. And the second bit that we've got into recently is to, using our data, develop a contextualized robotics adoption process. I'll talk a bit about that. So the presentation today will be the background, details of the study, some work in progress and preliminary findings. Everything all right?
Yeah, people on my can't see it.
Okay. Let me know if I should stop or keep going.
It's showing on mine, but I don't know why I can't see it.
Keep
You
going.
can continue.
Okay. So this is just a quick cheat sheet on external enablers. So to give you an idea what they are, I'll go into the proper description later on. External enabler is an external circumstance, and what Per's and colleagues' work has done is focus on the external element in business creation, venture creation, because so much of the literature is focused on the agent and on conditions. So this is very important to separate this external factor. And what we're saying there is that, for example, if you think of the external enabler as something that's acting upon an agent.
I'll just stop sharing.
Sorry.
Gives a strange message there.
And why is it only for host and co-host?
Maybe it's setting something for sharing. Click new share. Is there something, some box to tick on the bottom that says only for host or
And you can
click
test,
there?
test the microphone and sound. You know how to do that? This.
Can you click that button?
Oh, they can't see the screen.
They
Oh,
can't
okay,
see
I
it.
thought that they can hear.
That should be it. Everything's fine.
Which is the one that's left of?
Just go to that.
Share to get on the screen by using co-host. Sorry.
Yeah, just go.
Continue. Okay.
Okay, can we see that?
Oh, good.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Blowing up my name.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for fixing that. Okay, so for example, if we take the external enabler that is obvious in these times, COVID, what did it do? It acted on various agents around the world. Some examples there are, we have, at least in Brisbane, distilleries moved from making gin to making hand sanitizer. And the other one that I'm familiar with is a mining equipment company down in Ballarat, Victoria, switched from making mining equipment to making ventilators. So that just gives you an idea, just a very simple overview. The external enabler framework itself, which I'll talk more about later, conceptualizes these external enablers in terms of these things, the characteristics of them, the mechanisms, and the roles as what characterizes the external enabler, characterizes the kind of benefits and outcomes it can produce for a business, and the means by which it does so. Our research questions have two targets: enhancing the framework and also extending the framework. And the particular point of interest here for extending is that the framework is developed in the context of entrepreneurship and about venture formation. What we're trying to look at is how does it work? What insights can we get for that for established businesses, which is a different situation. So that's why I got the question mark there. So I'll tell you a bit about the study. External enabler is robotics, and if we go through those means of characterizing them, the type is technological, it's broad scope because robotics is impacting many, many kinds of businesses, and not just manufacturing. Relatively slow onset, robotics has been around for decades. But we notice that there's evolution, and included evolution in the most recent publication. And we see that happening. It has an impact on how companies are engaging with robotics. Our context is manufacturing in Australia. Australia has a small market. It's far away from the centres of robotics expertise and use. And manufacturing itself in Australia is in decline. Well, there are arguments that say that it's kind of having a turnaround. There's a lot of injection of funding and support from the government because it's so strategically important. It's a traditional industry, which means it has traditional attitudes and work practices, and a very large proportion of SMEs, not unlike many other industry sectors. Our methods. Our approach was empirical and qualitative. Our sampling, we knew that we wanted to look at manufacturing, but which sectors within manufacturing? So we looked at industry value added, government areas of priority, as shown on that little graph there, which I don't expect anyone to read, but it just shows you that we targeted the ones with the assistance of the arm hub. We looked for participants in those highest areas that had most importance for Australia. And of those participants that Arm Hub helped us identify, 40% participated, which was pretty good actually. They're all interested in finding out what other manufacturers are doing. And to entice them a little, we promised a report at the end which would summarise our findings. And there's been a lot of interest in that. For the data collection, we piloted our interview protocol first off to make sure we had the questions right and we're eliciting the right kind of responses. We did a 1-hour semi-structured interview of manufacturers. 9 of those were in person, 9 online, Zoom, Teams, that kind of thing. Because as you'll see later, they weren't all in Brisbane, they were around Australia, rural and urban. And recorded with permission, and when they didn't allow us permission, we wrote frantically and convened afterwards to try and capture what we could. For the analysis, the coding was particularly complex. It wasn't a straight coding exercise because we wanted to do many things with the data. First off, Anila and I worked very closely on this, and many acknowledgements to Owen for our thought processes there. It's just to give you an idea. First off, we extracted a conceptual idea from it and then coded that idea. So what were the people actually referring to in their statements like that? Oops, thanks, Della. Oops. Thank you. And then coded that for the deductive codes from the external enabler framework. And we were also including the effect of ecosystems because we know that knowledge sharing happens through ecosystems. So we were looking there for the industry insights. We developed codes from that as well and coded against that, developed those codes inductively. And then we tested how we coded. We did intercoder reliability, and we came out with very, very highly reproducible codes, which was all extremely painful, but important to do. And for interpretation, that's ongoing. Ella and I meet, discuss coding, and it's evolving, it's growing as we go. And talking to the Arm Hub team and the rest of the research team, years back, do that. So, all up, we've done 23 interviews, also 5 related organisations for our phase 2 studies on the ecosystem. But that just gives you an idea about the kinds of interviewees. So I had all very senior, other owners and founders, down to general managers and managers. Of the 18, there were 12 SMEs, 6 MNCs, multinational corporations, 16 established, 2 spin-outs, and the last one there, 12 urban, 6 regional. So it's not, it was very hard to get participants. And given that difficulty, that's a pretty good outcome. And the manufacturing sectors, a lot of metal fabrication, which is why I showed you the machine at the beginning, but also minerals and metals, equipment, and so on. So it's quite a varied range there. And as part of the interview, we asked participants to describe how they use robotics, how they're thinking about using robotics, to give us an idea about potential mechanisms and roles. And there's some there, 14 of them are actually using robotics now, but 3 are planned and 1 isn't. And we talked about the reasons why they're not using robotics, why they were so slow to take up robotics, and really kind of teased out their thinking about robotics. The benefits, well, it's kind of obvious, and it was reinforced with our interviews. It makes production faster and cheaper, and that's reflected in the mechanisms that we saw. Products have better quality, better reliability, better accuracy. Production process is more reliable. You don't have people not turning up and not being able to run your machines. Safer. There's a lot of a big incentive there on health and safety. Get people out of the dirty, dull, and dangerous work. And some of the applications we talked about with hot metal, minerals, steel, they're very dangerous environments. And new products are possible, and new markets can be serviced by increasing the volume. Don't have to read all that, just to show you that from those 18 interviews, there are a lot of different uses of robotics. And the types of robots, they've got industrial robots, like the first one that I showed you, very big and caged, off from human contact. Collaborative robots, which work with people, and there's a picture of that on one of the upcoming slides. And these collaborative robots are useful for doing things like machine tending, like taking parts out of one machine, putting it into the next, to free up a person for higher level work that's more demanding and not boring, and help retain people. Automated ground vehicles, you've seen those in the kind of videos of Amazon with little things trundling around quickly, fulfilling orders for people. Drones. Saw one just the other day on the bridge, obviously doing some work there, and they have a drone there looking at things. Bespoke robots, some of the people have, when there's a particular application that doesn't fit off-the-shelf robots, then they design their own. But it's very difficult and takes a lot of money and time, as you can imagine. But we talked through a few of those. For example, one of the ones in mineral production, where they have settling ponds. One of the applications there was they developed a little self-navigating robot to clean the bottom of the settling pond. And not only would that help better production, but also better environmental outcomes, to keep the runoff cleaner. And that's very important to mining companies, obviously, for license to operate. So it was interesting how we saw robots giving perhaps sometimes unexpected benefits. And some applications that aren't yet suitable for robots. And one of them we talked to was fruit handling. A particular kind of fruit that I can't say, or else you'll guess who the company was. But you would think that handling this particular piece of fruit would be easy. But it's not, because they're all different weights, they're slightly different shapes, and when they go in and they get skinned, then they have to be inspected, and if there's a little bit of peel still left on, so there's lots of dexterity things and vision recognition, and then there's the decision of what do you do with that bit of fruit. Is it peeled enough that it can go on, and so on. So these people have looked at this and they can't get the ROI on it. And it's pushing the limits of current capability with dexterity. The other one there was creation of complex architectural shapes, which would need, and a lot of these robots, they're kind of trying to mimic human craftsman actions. And that's one of the big issues there for this particular company was somehow codifying craftsperson knowledge, coding that into a robot. And that's kind of on the edges, and it's very exciting territory. So just to help bring this study to life a bit here, some quotes here about some important aspects. Obviously, you do robotics for competitiveness. That was a really, really strong outcome of people telling us. And we just couldn't do the volume of work we do without robotics. If we were trying to do that in Australia, we just couldn't come up with, we couldn't meet the target that was set. So onshoring, sovereign capability was very important. Sorry, just moved that again. There we go. Another important aspect was innovation. Now, most of this because the SMEs, they're short on time, they're short on money, they're short on thinking space because they're so busy. But one of the companies we talked to had enough spare resources to be able to experiment. And that was where we saw innovation coming in. And they actually created a spin-out company from this playing around, which was really interesting to notice. And they're saying there tremendous value from encouraging their staff to play. And we buy them whatever hardware, software they like. That's not your standard SME. And so they're just doing these wonderful things. And they created, well, from some of that, created a spin-out company. Okay, so here's the framework. External enabler, there's the proper definition, a distinct external circumstance that has that role in eliciting new business activities. The external enabler framework conceptualizes these in terms of their characteristics, roles, and mechanisms. So the little red rectangle around those. Not to look in complete detail at it because I know it's very small, but I'll describe it. The types of external enabler there are robotics is technological, that's the first one, but you'll also see other categories of regulatory, demographic, socio-cultural, etc., natural environment. And we saw a few of those come out in the data, as I mentioned before, with environmental benefits coming out. That was this social push for much more consciousness about the environment. It's really important to mining companies and companies who impact the environment. So that was part of their considerations. Characteristics, we've already talked about scope and onset. The mechanisms there, combination, compression, conservation, and so on. It's the way that the external enabler, in this case robotics, acts on what the company is doing to give the benefit. For example, with robotics, compression is about being able to do things in much shorter time. So that in a given day, instead of making 1,000 objects, maybe they can make 10,000 objects. And as a result of that, then what happens is they're able to service a bigger customer that perhaps can buy more products, and then has the impact of a role of the outcome enhancing. So let's just illustrate the kind of link through there. I'll talk a bit more about that. And also note that the external enabler is not in a vacuum. There's the agent there, so the properties of the agent are important. Is it a big company? Is it a small company? Is it an SME? Is it overseas headquarters? The headquarters, all of those properties of the agent and the context. What kind of industry is it? What are the attitudes in the industry? What are the traditional work practices? They all interact with the EE. Okay, so some preliminary results. In terms of EE types, we found that the ones in the framework perfectly covered everything. For the EE characteristics, and we've talked with Per about this, so I'll just preface these comments. This is what we're seeing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're new entries in the table, because I mean, there may be, but we have to be very careful and give it full consideration, because the point of having a framework is that it's useful, and it has to be, what's the proper word for this?
Parsimonious.
Parsimonious, that's the perfect word, yes. So you don't want to have unnecessary details there. And some of the mechanisms we've found, and we've started to discuss this with Per, maybe some of these aspects that I'll show on the next slide can be covered, maybe they can't, but we'll discuss that and work it through. We're expecting some changes for established organisations compared to venture formation, but we just need to be, discuss it properly. And we saw these three variants of robot types. Materiality, that's a huge thing with robots, because unlike things like COVID or the internet or other EEs, it makes it, if your factory hasn't got room to put in a robot, then you can't do it. And a few of the companies we've talked to have had to change premises in order to do so, to get that extra space. But then in other companies, they've been limited on space, so we've been able to choose a different type of robot, like a cobot, rather than an industrial robot. And complexity, I think that's a very relative thing, but robotics is very complex compared to something like perhaps social media or the internet or something like that. It's like a threshold amount of complexity there. And for E interactions, we saw a lot of interactions, because none of this occurs in the vacuum. As we said, there are other things going on in the world. And whilst robotics is out there, there's other things too, like regulations, COVID, labour market, macroeconomics, all those things affected. In terms of mechanisms and roles, like we said, we see resource substitution, that is substituting a robot for human labour, and resource compression, doing things much faster, as being the main things exhibited in all the study. We also saw, though this was perhaps unexpected, that there was resource creation. Having robots meant that you created data which you could use in really useful ways to improve your operation. Legitimation, we didn't expect that, but a lot of people told us that it's very important with customers that you have robots which really brings on the systems and the accuracy and the reliability. So it helps your reputation, builds a reputation of it, and legitimizes your operation. And market access, if you're making more product, you can service larger customers and get into that kind of market. Possible enrichments, extensions. The reliability was really important. That came through strongly, and we need to discuss further, is that already covered, or is it genuinely something new? Environmental benefit came through very strongly, and also health and safety. So we note these for discussion. For the roles, the most common roles were shaping the organisation, and that was through the production process. So change the routines of the organisation. And also outcome enhancing. Companies tended to be much more competitive, and they were able to keep operating or expand. Many of them were growing. And then shaping product, shaping market. A little surprising, we saw robotics had helped trigger the organisation to create a new company from its existing operations, and also to trigger transformation. When data was created, the companies were able to integrate their production process and become, just change the whole way that they operated, becoming much, much more effective. So to wrap up this bit of the preliminary results, insights for the robotics EE and insights for the EE framework. So with respect to robotics as an EE, we're saying that if we look at it at robotics, we see what the most common mechanisms are, and then maybe that can provide clues to a company wanting to engage with that EE about what's possible. And there's a whole suite of mechanisms. So you can look at the most common ones, but then ask as a thought-provoking experiment, well, what else could we do? What if we looked at this mechanism? How could we take advantage of that? We found additional characteristics to discuss further and consider the variance, materiality and complexity of robotics as an EE. And the interactions between EEs can suggest just a flag of caution perhaps to a company wanting to engage with robotics, but also could flag unforeseen issues, but also opportunities. With respect to the framework, I guess that is our ongoing thinking and discussion about those perhaps additional elements that we've found from our data. So questions arising, I guess what this suggests is, can the framework help establish firms to be more innovative? Can it help stimulate their thinking in a different way? Not just for robotics, but for any EE out there that they may be interested in. And provide guidance to firms preparing to engage with particular EE. Okay. Next bit, preliminary results 2. Robotics adoption process. And this is something a bit near my heart. We're working with Anna on innovation process in mining, similar kind of approach perhaps. Robotics adoption is important because robotics can give you such benefits, but it's really, really hard for companies to do it. So there's a lot of literature about adoption, technology adoption. But we also know that most of the studies have been quantitative, so you don't get that rich level of detail. And also these adoption processes like innovation are really context dependent. It depends on exactly what's going on, where it is, who's doing what the existing routines are. So we need a robotics model contextualised for Australian manufacturing. I think that would be really useful, and particularly the SMEs that really don't have much of an idea about what's required. They're really fumbling around in the dark a bit. So the steps were to look in our data and see what steps of adoption come out. Compare that with the literature. Then look at barriers, and that should be facilitators. We tried to use facilitator instead of enabler to avoid confusion. Then compare those with literature, map them to the steps. So let me show you what we got. So that's theory perspective, creating new theory, but also practice value to people who are wanting to engage. This is what our data told us. Is it readable? Not really. I'll tell you. All you need to know is there's a lot of steps there. And it kind of makes sense. Like there's the idea, and we go on to, is it suitable? The business case, there's some great quotes about this, which I'll put up next. Financing, people mentioned that government support was really important. The decision, finding the provider, or do you make it yourself? And if you do, how do you do that? Installing, like in a greenfield, versus brownfield. It's easier if you've got nothing there, you can design what you want. Getting the required performance, maintenance, ongoing learning, and finally you get your benefits. And people told us that just that learning process of getting the robotics to work gave them lots of ideas for what else they could do in their process with robotics and without robotics. So here's some quotes. For the suitability, sorry, we have people telling us, a lot of the SMEs, I know there's no water around. I'll be right. It's fine. That SME, you tend to have small orders. And so you don't have runs, oh boy, runs of 1,000 or 10,000 to deal with. Maybe there's only wine there. Thanks, Lord. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, so if you have small orders, robots don't make sense. Like they're saying there, I'll read it because I know it's small. Every single structure we build is unique, and everything is built the first time, and that makes it very problematic to robotify. But people that do use robots have found ways, things that they do multiple times, perhaps with different feeds to handle, and they put robotics in a particular section. So there are ways around some of it. Robotics evolution and hardware. This is about the cobots, and they're saying cobots are a game changer. Fencing off, shielding has been a big deterrent. And we spoke to some little SMEs that were developing his own cobot because he couldn't afford an industrial welder. So he was designing one himself, and you know, they go to extraordinary lengths. He was on Facebook to somebody in Romania to get hints, and then somebody in the US about something else, and just getting it all together. And it looks like it's going to work. Integrating and developing. The thing that holds us back from doing that is typically the complexity in developing the robot solution and the cost. And a lot of that comes around because we've got mature brownfield sites and the cost of interfacing the robots into those. If you're going to get a robot in, oftentimes they try to exactly replace what the human is doing, but that doesn't really work with the process. There are further benefits that can be achieved by looking at the process and rejigging that. And finally, the learning is really, really important. The learning of actually getting the robot to operate. It was pretty challenging 12 months. If you asked me at the 6-month mark, was it worth it? I would probably give you a different answer to what I give you today. Like, it was really a headache. It was really problematic. Interesting stuff. So how does that compare with what's going on in the literature? Adoption of robotics falls under the umbrella of adoption of advanced manufacturing technology. And there's a really, really nice paper, thank you, Rowan, that did a structured literature, systematic literature review of 87 relevant papers and synthesized all of the information and came up with that model. Now, it might not look earth-shattering, but what it means is that it's consistent with what's been theorised about adoption of advanced manufacturing technology. And we compared our steps with that, and look, most of it is consistent, which is great. It's a bit reassuring, but we're also finding steps there that aren't really explicitly captured, like financing is incredibly important to our participants, and finding a provider and developing a bespoke robot. And for that, the context in Australia comes into it. It's a relatively immature ecosystem, so there are some providers, but there are problems. Some of them are tethered to robot makers, and so they only consult on that type of robot, and they go away and leave you with a robot that doesn't work. It's complex. So it's not looking too bad. Then we look at barriers and facilitators for the process. And these are just the main ones. There are several, and it's kind of early stages in working through these. But the important ones there are lack of time, skills and space for the SMEs. One of the people there was saying that, yeah, we'd really love to have robots, but we've got no time to even think about it. And we've thought of hiring somebody for a year for $200,000 or something who's an expert in it, but we haven't got the money and we haven't got the time to write a grant to get the money. So it's really, really tight. Other things are the volume versus bespoke aspect. They're just not making enough product to justify robots. But, oh, it's okay. And integrating with existing processes is a real difficulty. But I think the message coming through for Barris is if you don't know what you're doing, it's really, really hard. It's hard to find somebody who knows what they're doing. And facilitators are skills like previous experience. A number of our people had had jobs in other companies where they use robots or where they put in robots, and they're able to bring some of that, not necessarily specifics of those robots, but just the approach, who you work with, the integrators, what kind of things need to be done, and also collaborating and with the robot producers, the robot integrators, specialists in the area, but also with organisations like the Arm Hub, which are brokers, which are set up to bring together these various components of the ecosystem that don't necessarily talk to each other. And strong systems in project management, innovation systems, and strategy, really, really important. So that's kind of where we are there. It's pretty early cases on the robotics adoption process. And our next steps are to work on engagement and dissemination. And engagement, I have a workshop with the Arm Hub and their team there, and throw some ideas around. Send out highlights of this to our participants and a final report, and bring them back together and get them talking to each other and to us, get further insights, and reach out to robotics professional groups. We were talking with some of those the other day. Obviously funding, and we're still building up to that, building our case for that and identifying who we might be able to work with. And papers and practitioner papers, we want to do both of those, and I think the work lends itself to that with the theory and practice components. And next phase after this is looking at the ecosystem that supports this. So I hope that's been interesting. I hope that has shown you some a cool picture. Yep, so thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you all for attending, and so let's open the floor for some questions. And let's start with a question in the room, and then Anisha can see if there are also some questions online. So somebody who wants.
Fascinating, given it's not at all my field. I was interested in the idea of robots. You know, you go through your entire process and you get this fabulous new robot.
Yep.
Wonderful. Is there a point where they start to become obsolescent though, and you kind of have to see it as not an enabler, but it's an inhibitor? You're talking about robotics as being something that's been a part in various ways of Australian manufacturing for decades.
Yep.
So at what point does your whiz-bang robot become popular?
I think,
And not
yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. One of the people that we talked to told us about a 70-year-old machine that was still in use. And it was still doing exactly what it was meant to do, and it was just fine. There was no business case for changing that. And I think that's where the business case comes into it. You find a lot of workarounds. And so if the robot's in there and it's becoming, what was the word that you used, like instead of an enabler, an inhibitor, yeah, then that really comes back to their strategy and their business case for these things. But I guess what we've seen is that as long as it's doing what it needs to do, so that it's less costly than, say, the 3-year return on investment that some of these people talk about, then it's okay. But if it's causing problems in terms of their earnings and their strategy, then they'll act on it. But there needs to be that specific prompt to do something about it. Yeah.
We talk of temporal scope of enablers. So if there's a particular type of robotic technology that is an enabler that eventually is overrun by other technology solutions, well, that's the end of the temporal scope of that narrow type of robotics.
Right.
Now we talk mostly of robotics here as an evolving technology area, and that remains an enabler for some ventures because it provides new ways of doing it.
Right. Yeah.
And so the context again, robotics, manufacturing, so it's all very asset capital intensive. So yeah, in IT, we think about new technology every year, but yeah, in this context, you think about 10, 20 years that often the time frames are that at least these machines operate. And like Janine said, sometimes machines are for 40, 50, 60 years.
I think the average age of like automated equipment in Australia is like 20 to 30 years. It's quite,
Thank you. I think it's very interesting presentation. I can see that a lot of work went into this coding and data collection, and I would love to see where it goes further, because it seems that it's now reaching some preliminary findings, but it will need time to reach like refined ones. Considering refined ones, I'm very curious. Can you explain where does, I think the last slide was, or the one before the last, was about enabling robotics and disabling robotics, something like pro and quo. How does it fit and build on existing framework that they're developing in the mechanisms and everything?
I see it as something similar but different, right? Because the framework talks about outcomes and it talks about mechanisms.
Yeah.
But correct me here if I'm wrong there, but it doesn't talk about a processual view of it. Like it talks about how it happens, but what the adoption model is doing is suggesting that it is a process that it unfolds over time. So
Would
it's
mechanisms be
processual.
different?
Sorry?
Would mechanisms be different in time as well?
Yeah, could be. So we kind of follow two approaches that we still have to think a bit about how can we kind of let them maybe benefit from each other. So one was indeed our a priori model, external enablers. We know we're going to do that, and with a bit of conceptual thinking, but also serendipity, we ended up doing robotics for manufacturing. It was always clear in some way we will analyze it using external enablers. The other one was more bottom up. Hey, now we do robotics in manufacturing. What do we see happening a lot in this context? And ultimately, a lot of that is about technology adoption. Robots as a technology, how does it get adopted? And a lot of people mentioned different things like, I got the idea because I was part of a robotics Facebook group, and other people talked about, we have to do a business case, and then they talk about how hard it is to implement. So we saw that they always talk about these different steps. So that triggered us to say, hey, as an additional framework, which is more driven bottom up by this specific context, we're going to look at that innovation adoption process that already has been contextualized in this setting, where they talk about advanced manufacturing technologies. And so the idea of the facilitators and inhibitors is following that literature review and research policy, that they also nicely link the facilitators and inhibitors to the different steps in the process. And so then we can also see, do we see different things? Do we see new facilitators and inhibitors in that innovation process? That's the third idea indeed. How can we maybe leverage some of the innovation process literature and compare that to which is more the venture creation process, which is underlying the role side of the external enablement framework. So we're still doing some interviews. So we're really in an early phase of analytics. So this is data analysis. So this is really like get very preliminary tentative insights to see where we are going with this and to get some feedback and discussion.
It's kind of like a Pez and colleagues framework is the big picture. It's like top level, what's happened, what happens, what could happen, what are the opportunities. The adoption process is more like, if I'm looking at it from a practical perspective, if I'm a company, how would I do that? I know nothing about robotics. What's involved? How would I do that? What sequence of events has to happen in order for me to realize a mechanism of compression?
Oh, okay, so practices and like practical steps to actually conduct those
Yeah,
mechanisms.
to achieve what the framework says that you might be able to achieve with robotics.
Yes. So ultimately, those steps could be given to the arm hub, and they could just, whenever they visit them a meeting, they could say, okay, understand the robotics journey. Yes, you now have an idea, but and before you reach the benefits, you have to think about testing it, implementing it. There's often a learning phase where you still don't directly have the benefits because you have to do tweaking and so on. So to kind of give these SMEs realistic expectations. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's Anna and
There's a
Carol
question online.
and online.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anna.
I think you kind of answered mine
Ladies
already.
first.
I was going to ask you a little bit more about, okay, so how do businesses use that?
Okay.
But I think, yeah, I'm great at getting the picture. We're
Well,
trying
that's
to
something
break
that
it
we're
down
trying
so
to
they can
develop.
really understand.
Trying to make it
what's
a tool.
involved. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
for awareness, expectations, and help them to get started. Anna?
That's a question. Given the established nature of the manufacturing industry and how long the robots have been sort of there without changes, is there an appetite from the industry to develop and implement, radically novel robots, or do something that hasn't been thought of? And also the second kind of question to this, how is the other organizations and industry in general prepared for this type of step change innovation? And for a follow-up, and also that external enabler framework and the external enablers, how can they impact the adoption process, trying to marry the two frameworks?
Okay. First question, we didn't really see a big appetite for exciting novel things. It was very much a few, but most of them were trying to keep their business going. And that was very much doing what they already did, but in a better way, an improved way. There are a few of them that were tackling new things that tended to be the ones that had more money, more time, and perhaps were a bit bigger. And the last one was about marrying the framework.
External enablers and sort of how they would impact the adoption process.
How differences in external enablers would impact. Yes, that would be very interesting. Yes, noted. Thanks for that.
I'd like to comment on that. Can I do that?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
So, I mean, you started with sort of the goals of this sort of extend and enhance the framework, and you have some aspects of that, but you didn't at that point. So the goal is to help practice, to apply this to help practice, and that is quite okay as well, and it's also a contribution to the external framework, because one aspect of it is to improve it as a practitioner. In that context, it makes a lot of sense to combine it with the adoption stuff.
Right.
For sort of because we know of all those things that makes it difficult to. So it's not always that you will find from the SMEs themselves the new ideas about mechanisms and so forth.
Sure.
Sometimes you will from lead users and so forth. But it may be more from lead users, industry bodies in collaboration with academic research, maybe that sort of finds the potential. Then you need to match that with what we know about adoption processes in order to facilitate how can this happen? How can this happen?
Okay.
And we need to respect that the businesses, they just want to keep the business going, but they may be doing themselves a disservice by not innovating enough, because
That's right.
keeping
And
the
that's-
business going. Yeah, but it suggests that sort of one way of getting there is starting with incremental innovation.
Yeah.
Maybe there can be shared robotic resources, so they don't have to make
There
it.
is a lot there about awareness. Awareness is a huge component in this. That was that first step back, getting ideas. Where do they get their ideas from? They're so short of time.
But we also know from the adoption and diffusion literature about trialability, for example. So if this is huge investments. They sort of, if there was some kind of shared capacity that they could use in their process to get started.
Yes, so one of the aspects is visibility there also.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and then so what we see is that manufacturers visit other manufacturers to see what they're doing, and because it's a physical artifact, yes, it's also beneficial for the visibility side of innovation. And I think I think there's two major things that so far, and we still early on, the external neighborhood framework gives us. I think the importance of interactions. So we see that there's this new momentum for robotics because of sovereign capabilities, COVID, labor market problems, Australian government priorities. So there's all these other enablers that kind of interact with the technology enabler
And that is
give it that momentum.
that is academically, scholarly interesting as well.
Yeah.
And we find that, and this is one of the things that is a shortcoming in pre-EE research on external changes. Often they focus on one change and what it does, right?
Yeah, so that's in the adoption process that just focuses on the robotics, but it doesn't really, if you would just look at the adoption process, it wouldn't really bring to light that actually the trigger is maybe not the robotics itself, but these other.
And you're talking about this combination of the sustainability push and the technological potentials, for example.
Yeah. And the other thing is indeed, I think it gives you kind of the standard path. Traditionally, robotics is resource replacement. You replace humans by robots, and therefore you do process shaping. And so then you can also start thinking about what are the innovations, are there other mechanisms you can apply, are there other roles that robotics can. So I guess it gives you a pathway to what is common and what may be like becoming more and more hygiene factors. Every manufacturer should consider these mechanisms and roles of robots, and where can the real innovation happen? So can you apply robots in relation to different mechanisms and different roles? Yeah.
Being conscious of the time here. We've got
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
plus online, but noted, and thank you, and we will get it.
Very quick question.
And then Michael.
So when let's say an entrepreneur wants to start a business that requires lots of robotics, so for example, wants to upgrade their existing robots. A lot of planning and awareness is certainly important, but we don't have all the resources and expertise, and we have to work with vendors, and even those vendors work with other vendors sometimes. Just a quick question: in your interviews, have you collected data or interviewed vendors as well?
We've interviewed one. That's really part of that related organisation. We've heard many comments from the manufacturers about that ecosystem and vendors and integrators.
So we have a two-phase approach. The first phase we start with manufacturers, and the second phase, and we hope you find a way to get some additional funding for that, to talk to what we call the wider ecosystem. So indeed, we've interviewed some, so ARMA, CSRO, of the research partners. We talked to one manufacturer, but we need to talk to a few more robotic integrators, one or two more manufacturers.
And already it's pretty evident that these integrators, for example, that may have head offices overseas or robotics manufacturers who make overseas, they have the potential to really be the conduit for knowledge flow in this ecosystem. It's really, really critical for if you're getting a robot to have these linkages and have these collaborations. And it's kind of immature in Australia at the moment, Michael.
Yeah, great presentation, great work. Are there any relationships between the mechanisms? So you talked a lot about substitution,
Yeah.
but not a lot about expansion, which is I think very surprising. Any sequence, like you have to substitute before you can expand, any sort of insight?
Yeah, I think substitution is the basic thinking of the robot. You have human tasks and you replace it with a robot. But then indeed you see some so that influences other mechanisms like legitimation. So companies like to be seen as high tech. That's also good towards their customers. So having a few robots in your factory just makes you look like
It's surprising that a lot of 3D printing is used to expand immediately. A lot of 3D printers print stuff that couldn't produce otherwise.
Yep.
So you leapfrog to expansion, while you talk about substitution now as a prerequisite for maybe expansion, but you don't even see that anymore. So trying to work out among those 8 or 9 mechanisms, are there any sort of temporal causal relationships? Do they build on each other?
Yeah, good question.
And if you don't have the answer, that's fine as well. As so like listening to you, it sounded like one mechanism is sort of prerequisite, what Irvin said before another kicks in.
Yes, and so what you see is the main driver is the substitution effect, and a lot of companies, particularly the next new generation of robots that are more capable of collecting data, applying AI, and so on. It's kind of okay, the next phase for these companies. Okay, now we have the robot. Can we better use the data it generates for quality management?
In terms of resource expansion, I'm just thinking of one with one of those robots that was being developed to clean the pipes and the tanks in a continuous mineral production process. That would expand it would give greater equipment availability with the net effect of expanding their equipment and expanding the resources that they had to produce their product.
I think the number of examples of expansion.
Yeah.
I just try to work out, can you leapfrog straight to them? What do you
Yeah,
use
I see what you're asking. But,
I think so. In most companies we talk to have the brownfield scenario, so they have an existing production line, so they're substituting. The expansion idea would come back to back, and we had 1 or 2, but that's more in the planning stage. Like somebody was planning to build a whole new factory in Australia, and that was, let's say, straight away, okay, I cannot build this if I don't mainly use robotics to do this. And we've seen 1 or 2 other examples. It's not in our data. We still plan to talk to them, like one of the COVID companies that developed a new product for COVID. They seem to be exemplary for trying to implement almost anything using robotics there.
is anyone still online in this?
Yeah.
Greg had a comment on absorptive capacity.
What's the question, sir?
Greg asked is, do we see
Describe the
absorptive capacity?
characteristics of those who did have those absorptive capacities. Yeah. Money, curiosity, and knowledge. Experience was a huge one there, because with absorptive capacity, which tells you about how effective you are at learning something and embedding it in your process. One of the huge predictors of success there is knowledge about it to start with and experience to start with. So yes, all of those things plus experience is very important.
Jen, I have one last question.
Yes.
Just thinking like a business person.
Yes, good.
Practical head on. I look at all of that and I think, how does that help work out my ROI?
The ROI is up to how you choose to do it. And there was a quote which was in one of my other versions, I think, unfortunately, about building a business case. And with robotics, it's very hard to do because it's so expensive, and it depends on forecasting your production years out. And
So
the robotics is one factor in that.
well, some companies decide on robotics based on ROI, and others decide on robotics more based on a strategic vision. They say, I don't know the exact ROI, but I know we have to do this. So so if you think
That's
about
probably more.
That's
sort of
and
So-
one person, for
sometimes,
example,
yeah.
was saying he was at a conference in the US, and he said, how do you get a business case? He's tried a zillion ways of doing it and he can't do it. And the person said to him, well, I'm only in the industry for 5 more years, so I want to have fun. And he was a business owner, so he put his own money in for the
But
robotics.
it's a simple answer. Correct me if I'm wrong, that the framework doesn't really have economic lens. It talks about possibilities, but any sort of economic assessment is
Yeah.
part of scope.
Or how do you do it? It's inconsistent, yeah.
So inconsistent is just, I don't think that's what you intended.
No, I mean, that's another level of.
That's what I
You-
mean.
you
you know,
can't
like-
Yeah, so that's
compare
more an
them, is what I
innovation
mean.
process where we
Yeah.
have this step of
It's
business
It's
case.
apples and
Explanatory
oranges.
power of a framework.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
explains a lot, it just can't explain why.
You can't quantify.
No, I mean, it says that any external change will help some businesses in some ways.
Yeah.
It's up to them
Correct.
to find that out.
Correct.
And that it is in an economically viable way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's fair enough to say it's beyond what the
Thank
framework
you,
can
thank you,
explain.
people.
Well, so a lot of
online.
these things we put in the adoption process actually, like also like more like the inhibitors that